There's an urban legend that's been around for decades, one claiming that if a nuclear war ever wiped out almost everything else alive on the planet, cockroaches would still make it through. That legend turns out to be half true and half myth. And the real story is far more interesting than the folklore, because this creature's actual abilities sound like something out of science fiction. A body that keeps living for weeks without its head, a respiratory system that can go without air far longer than you'd expect, and an exoskeleton strong enough to hold up a weight hundreds of times its own. How old is this body plan really? And why has evolution barely bothered to change it after all these millions of years? Is it actually true that cockroaches could survive a full-scale nuclear war? Or is that only a half-confirmed urban legend? How is it even possible for a body to keep living for days on end without a head? What else can this creature survive that most people have no idea about, like going without air entirely? And how does something with a rigid outer shell manage to squeeze through gaps a fraction of its own height? By the end of this story, you'll have answers to all 5 questions. Fossil evidence shows cockroaches have existed on Earth for more than 320 million years, meaning the ancestors of today's cockroaches showed up during the Carboniferous period, long before the dinosaurs and long before the first flowering plants, and lived through at least one of the largest mass extinctions in the planet's history. Over that enormous stretch of time, the basic look of a cockroach has changed remarkably little. The core body plan, a flat, streamlined build, long, fast legs, and a tough, segmented shell, turned out to be such a successful piece of engineering that evolution never found a reason to overhaul it. And the same basic shape that helped a cockroach's ancestors survive in the swampy forests of the Carboniferous still works just fine today in basements and kitchens around the world. It's exactly this multi-million-year track record that gave rise to the most famous legend about this insect. The idea that a cockroach can survive absolutely anything, including the literal end of the world. But before buying into that legend completely, it's worth testing it the same way nature tested the cockroach itself, with facts, not rumors. The legend that cockroaches would survive a nuclear war didn't come from nowhere. After the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, witnesses reported seeing cockroaches still scurrying around the rubble, and that image stuck permanently in popular culture as a symbol of ultimate toughness. The reality is more interesting than a flat myth, but noticeably more modest than the legend. Because cockroaches, unlike humans, really do have elevated radiation resistance. By different estimates, they can withstand a dose of radiation roughly 10 to 15 times higher than what's considered lethal for a person. And the reason comes down to cell division, since cells are most vulnerable to radiation damage right at the moment they divide. And in cockroaches, that division only happens right before molting, far less often than in many other organisms, which limits the cumulative damage from exposure. But this is exactly where the legend runs into trouble. When the producers of one popular science television show decided to test the myth experimentally and exposed several insects, including cockroaches, to high doses of radiation, cockroaches weren't the toughest survivors at all, and that title went to flower beetles, the only insects tested that made it through the highest dose used in the experiment. So even among insects alone, the cockroach isn't the most radiation-resistant species. And that's not even the bigger problem with the legend, since radiation resistance has nothing to do with surviving the blast itself. The extreme heat and shockwave of an actual nuclear explosion would kill a cockroach just as it would kill the vast majority of living things near the epicenter. And the legend wasn't born from a scientific experiment, but from watching survivors at the edges of a devastated city, where radiation levels and destruction were already far lower than at ground zero. So the myth turns out to be exactly half right. Radiation resistance on its own is a real confirmed fact. But the idea of the cockroach as a completely indestructible creature is a clear exaggeration. Meanwhile, another one of this insect's abilities, one that gets talked about far less, turns out to be much closer to the truth. You can find claims online that a decapitated cockroach can survive for as long as 9 days, a number that has practically become internet folklore, passed from one video to the next. But real scientific observations give a more modest, still remarkable range. A cockroach's body, once separated from its head, can go on living anywhere from a few days to roughly 2 weeks. The reason comes down to how the insect's nervous system is built. Unlike a human, where nearly all bodily control is centered in the brain, a cockroach handles a huge share of its vital functions through a network of nerve clusters called ganglia, spread along the length of its body, mainly in the thorax. And these are what's actually responsible for breathing and basic movement coordination, which is why the body can keep functioning even after losing its head entirely. A cockroach also doesn't breathe through its head or mouth in any conventional sense, since air enters its body through a row of tiny openings called spiracles, located along the sides of its torso. And that's exactly why losing the head doesn't cause immediate suffocation the way it would in most vertebrates. The respiratory system simply isn't physically tied to the head at all. The severed head itself keeps showing signs of life for a while too, its antennae twitching in response to stimuli, until whatever resources were left inside it finally run out. In the end, a headless body doesn't die from the lack of a brain itself. Researchers who've studied this process point out that a cockroach's brain is mainly responsible for processing sensory input from the eyes and antennae, for navigation, and for some social behaviors, but not for keeping basic life functions running. And the real cause of death is thirst, since without a mouth, the body simply can't drink, ultimately dying of dehydration rather than anything directly caused by losing its head. Considerably more modest than 9 days of internet legend, but no less remarkable for it. And since this creature's breathing is built in such an unconventional way to begin with, that same unconventional approach hides one more unexpected ability. Since a cockroach breathes through dozens of tiny openings along its sides, rather than through one centralized organ like a lung, its need for a constant oxygen supply works differently than it does in most vertebrates. A cockroach can hold its breath for up to 40 minutes and can survive being fully submerged underwater for as long as half an hour without suffering critical oxygen deprivation. This fact rarely makes it into lists of a cockroach's most impressive abilities, overshadowed by the flashier stories about radiation and decapitation. But it's exactly what explains why a cockroach is so hard to drown or suffocate by simply cutting off its air supply. The 3 abilities covered so far, radiation resistance, surviving without a head, and going without air for extended periods, already paint the picture of a creature remarkably well equipped for disaster. But the most practically useful and least widely known ability has nothing to do with surviving extreme conditions at all. It's about how its own body handles a perfectly ordinary day. One of the most recognizable images associated with cockroaches is the sight of one vanishing into a crack that looks, at first glance, far too narrow to fit even part of its body. And for a long time, this stayed more of a household observation than a subject of serious scientific study, until a team of researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, set out to understand the mechanics behind it, using high-speed cameras and a purpose-built device for controlled insect compression. The results were far more impressive than even the researchers expected. A cockroach can compress its own body down to 40 to 60% of its resting height, squeezing through gaps only a quarter of its normal standing height. And it keeps moving the whole time, switching to an unusual style of locomotion in which its legs splay out to the sides and generate movement through friction against the surfaces above and below. The secret lies in the architecture of the outer shell itself. A cockroach's exoskeleton isn't one rigid plate. It's made up of many individual segmented plates connected by flexible membranes, a structure that works something like origami, folding and compressing in a controlled way while staying strong enough not to break. And experiments found that a cockroach's body can withstand a load somewhere between 300 and 900 times its own weight without any permanent damage. A cockroach's normal, uncompressed running speed, scaled to the length of its own body, is so fast that at human scale, it would be equivalent to running at roughly 200 miles an hour, though that speed drops while compressed, the body moving several times slower in a tight space. But even then, a cockroach doesn't stop or get stuck. It keeps moving forward, just in a slower, gliding style, powered by friction rather than a normal stride. A team of researchers used what they learned to build a small robot with a flexible, segmented body capable of compressing and squeezing through narrow gaps, just like a real cockroach. With an eye toward using devices like it in search and rescue operations, helping locate survivors trapped under rubble after earthquakes, which makes for a rare case where the exact quality of this insect that most people find instinctively repulsive turned out to be the inspiration for a technology that could potentially save human lives. A cockroach is a body plan that's barely changed in more than 320 million years, and it's exactly that long track record that gave rise to the legend of its total invincibility. Under close inspection, that legend turns out to be exactly half myth. Radiation resistance is real, but it isn't limitless, and a cockroach wouldn't survive an actual nuclear blast any more than most other living things would, while its other abilities, the ones that get far less attention online, hold up, almost without exception. A body that can keep functioning for weeks without a head, thanks to a decentralized nervous system. A respiratory system with no single centralized organ, letting it go without air for up to 40 minutes. And an exoskeleton built like origami, able to bear hundreds of times its own body weight while squeezing through a gap a quarter of its own height. The most interesting thing about this creature isn't what gets talked about most often. It's that the real science turns out to be more modest than the rumors in some places, and far more astonishing than them in others. Tell us in the comments which of these 5 facts surprised you the most, and whether, in your opinion, the nuclear war legend deserves even half its reputation. Right now, somewhere in the dark, in a crack behind a baseboard or under a rock, one of these creatures is putting the exact same body plan to work that helped its distant ancestors survive millions of years before a single dinosaur walked the earth, let alone a human being capable of turning it into an urban legend.